right, here we go. It's been a while, and I'm excited to be back. This is my first podcast at UBC, and it's going to take a little bit of a different form than ones I've done in the past. It is actually a monologue of some kind. There's nobody else here, it's just me. And I am giving a presentation, you could say, or solo podcast in response to my history professor's final project. This class is for Communism 104, and the project title is called Communism and What? So, what I'm essentially doing is most of these projects have been formatted as papers and final essays and research documents. And for me, I've written way too many of those in the last couple months, and so I have asked to present my podcast or project in the form of a podcast. Now, the criteria for our assignment was to look at a specific era in communist history and a specific state encompassing a specific topic. The one that I chose spoke highest towards me and my personal interests that have developed at UBC, including sociology, philosophy, economics, business, and the fabric, or really the clock that makes the world tick. These have all kind of come together to interest me as a human and make me think. And so I wanted to take a look at what economics looked like outside of a free market system, a capitalist system. The closest thing to that is socialist communism and Norway in our time, but for the purposes of this history class, I decided to look at post-World War II, which is essentially late Stalinism and early throw periods of the USSR and the Soviet Union. Before we get into it, I want to establish a couple things about the relationship of Russia with America. I think that that's going to come up a lot throughout this podcast, and it's going to be incredibly important. So, there are two traditional forms of economic system that we have. There was the communist or socialist system that is a centralized economy, essentially. This is completely opposite from the capitalist society that we live in, that is free market, which means that the private sector dictates everything. These two economic systems have a form in philosophy or society, not socialism, but society, that is monumentally different. One is equity and one is equality. And these two, although sounding very similar and seeming to be very similar, are incredibly polar opposite. And defining these two ideologies is actually incredibly important to really understanding the difference between a communist economic system and a capitalist economic system. So, equality, this is the freedom. It means that we're all equal, right? Well, kind of. What equality is a system is trying to implement a world where everybody is equal, not in outcome, but in starting point. This indicates the idea that we all have the same opportunities in life to proceed and advance. And an individual's success or failure will be solely based on their own merit, their own intelligence, and their own ambition. This contrasts to equity because equity's goal is to make an equal outcome. If you want to visualize it, you can imagine people standing close to a wall and trying to see over it. Now, the tallest person, the person with the most privilege, they can see over the wall and it's fine. And if everybody was standing on an even playing field, then maybe only the tallest person would be able to see over the wall. And that's essentially what equality kind of is, although the goal of the society is kind of to mitigate the height of everybody, if you want to look at height as merit. It wants to make it so everybody has an equal opportunity to succeed, and whereas equity would give individuals with the lowest or the shortest people, the least innate talent and skill, a higher block to stand on. The government would give them extra support, boosting them up so that everybody can stand over the wall. Now, this is a really pretty analogy, and it makes equity seem really, really appealing. So why is equity associated with communism, which has been taught to us to be a negative connotation for most of our lives? Well, the thing is that in an equity society, in an aquatic In a society that perpetuates equity, many individuals lose their drive. It actually punishes talent and perpetuates an idea of failing to be better. You have life easier. You don't have to try as hard. You don't have to work as hard. You don't have to push yourself and try and succeed because you can always rely on the government to help you out. Now, these are the two fundamental differences. We have a socialist economy and a capitalist economy. And this is going to come up several times throughout the podcast, and that was the first thing that I want to define before we dive too far into 1945's USSR economics. The second thing that I want to establish is Russia's early half of the 20th century and the history there, because it's really, really fascinating if you look at it outside from an objective perspective, I would say, because the USSR has gotten a lot of bad rep for being communism. I mean, they're associated with communism. They're essentially the first application of Marxist theory ever, which is something I'll also get into. But a lot of the things that they've done right are overshadowed by this connotation with communism. And I want to establish something here, and it's that Russia is a truly, truly remarkable country. The citizenship and the people that are in it have done stuff, have survived and flourished in an environment that many, many other people would consider a cascade of backbreaking events. To give you some context of what I'm talking about, before World War I, Russia was a third world economic country. What I'm saying is they were a country ruled by a Tsarist dictatorship and were fundamentally poor. Every citizen other than that top 1%, majority was something called a serf or a peasant or a farmer, were illiterate and uneducated. So what I'm saying is you're looking at the largest landmass of people in a cold country who very, 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 very few are truly educated. Later, in 1904, they go to World War I at the call of the Tsarist Empire and lose badly, like really badly. Afterwards, there's a lot of hatred, argument, fighting, a certain level of despise from the civilians to the Tsarist Empire, and this gives way for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to rise up and create a revolution. This is the October Revolution of 1917 and the first real attempt or implementation of communism and Marxist theory, because it had never been done before. There was no template for applied communism. So we're now sitting in 1917 and there's a communist revolution going on within a poor society. This is not the type of world that Marx envisioned. He believed that it could not be an agricultural society. It had to be an industrial society, an advanced society to be communist. And so already kind of going off on the wrong foot of what the mother of communism, the forefather of communism asked for. But here we are. And it turns out that a lot of people didn't want this to happen. A lot of people who had fought in World War I, and particularly, were not interested in the Russians changing sides. So now we have a civil war within Russia from 1917 to 1923. This was a 5-year conflict between the Red Army, the Socialist Revolution, and the White Army, the anti-revolutionaries. Incredibly enough, the Red Army won against all odds, and partly that it was against all odds is because the White Army was backed by 4 global superpowers at the time. We had Britain, we had France, we had Japan, and America all working with the White Army to quell this new socialist revolution. Something I want to bring up here to think about, it's just a food for thought, but this was Americans militarily setting foot on Russian soil, something that you can never say has been done in vice versa. Take what you want from that, but I do think that is an interesting point to note. Now, the Red Army won and the Socialist Revolution occurred, and Lenin began implementing all of these rules. He began implementing his form of applied Marxism, and it became his own ideology, Leninism, Marxism. Now, this is really impressive on the whole, not only because Russia itself was a poor country and the USSR had just lost a major war, but he's also implementing these theories that have never been done before. There is no template, there is no framework. There is a framework of ideology, but there's no applicable way of execution yet. Marx and Engels in particular, they weren't even politicians. They had no idea how to run a country. They were philosophers, and ironically enough, bourgeois philosophers at that, who were creating this idea of a utopian society based on writings of Plato and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote the Reluctant Fundamentalists not the Reluctant Fundamentalists, the Discourse on Inequalities. Anyways, you're at this stage where he's implementing his new form of communism, and he's applying it to this world that Marx had thought would be impossible, and he's doing it, and he's succeeding. And for the next couple of years, there is turmoil, there's misunderstanding, everything's a little different, everything's a little new, but on the whole, it's going fairly well, minus the famine and the poverty and the United States doing that thing where they caused a global Great Depression, and when the U.S. sneezes, the whole world coughs. Anyways, for about the next 15 years, Lenin is doing it. Well, not 15 years. For the next couple of years, Lenin is doing his thing until until he dies and leaves office, and he is replaced by Stalin. Many of you may know Stalin. He is one of the most infamous characters in the last decade, or last century, and is responsible for an exorbitant number of deaths. The reason I bring this up is because now Russia is officially the USSR and a communist country, but also is about to enter a period of internal genocide, where Stalin does not want to hear any reproach. He does not want to hear anybody disavow his beliefs, and so he goes on a kind of insane campaign of forced industrialization and economic growth. And this is the sole focus. They pay attention to nothing else. They do not care about the society. They do not care about human lives. They do not care about society, which in that case I want to put emphasis on, because communism is supposed to be caring about the people. It is now, communism, the USSR in particular, is now creating its own oxymoron and moving beyond what it was originally intended to do. So 1937, the Great Terror starts, and this is subsequently responsible for 70,000 murders or deaths of Russian civilians. This is 1937 to 1938, and World War II is just around the corner, those who know your chronological history. World War II then begins, and Russia is forced into it. We have a treaty, a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Russia that was set up because Russia knew they couldn't survive, and Germany wanted to focus solely on the Western Front. He wanted to invade France, he wanted to worry about Britain, and he didn't want to have to fight a war on two sides. We all know how that went later, but the idea here is to understand is that Stalin was a very intelligent man. He really was, but he was also ruthless. And coming into post-World War II era, the Russians left that campaign and that battle with the highest death toll ever out of any nation that participated in World War II. I believe it was about 26 million Russians died. So it's now 1945, and in the last 45 years, not even half a century, Russia has gone through 2 world wars, moved from economic disparity, being one of the poorest countries in the world when you compared to the quantity and size of it, an internal civil war, a mass genocide, and the highest number of deaths possible from any nation or any nationality within the World War II. And they've come out on the other side, and somehow they are the second strongest global superpower in the world. And I shined a light on this because it sets the framework for the discussion that I'm talking about here, but it also brings to light the unbelievable capabilities of a society when they are single-minded, single-focused. I don't know, there is no other story in recent history that can talk about a country that has gone through so much, lost so much, and still somehow turned their entire economic policy around into the position that they did. I don't know if this is a trait of communism in society or if it speaks volumes to the Russians as a whole. As much as I've praised the USSR for their economic 180-degree turnaround and ability to fight through a cascade of events that ended in a predominantly male economy that only had 54 men to every 100 women, I cannot deny the undeniable hypocrisy and economic shortcomings of the USSR on the whole. If I'm going to be honest, the USSR made some of the worst economic decisions in history, and this is predominantly due to their centralized economy that is completely polar opposite to the free market economy we live in today. A free market economy is a system that is genuinely or generally perpetuated by supply and demand and quantified and designated by the free market or the private sector. Now, this is completely different from a centralized economy, which the USSR operated in, where a single point of legislation, of control, of rule would allocate the amount of resources each faculty within the industry received and dictated and quantified the amount of production they needed to produce with the resources they gave. This system was incredibly inefficient and didn't make any sense from an economic standpoint, but worked very nicely within their ideology, and that's why they chose to do it. A part of the reason that they were capable of doing this was because of the sheer size of the USSR to begin with. The USSR, mind you, at this point had just quote-unquote liberated hundreds of countries from the German Nazi invasion and had been rewarded handsomely for it. They now had 15 communist states under their control and were able to force them to join into their centralized economy, and also formulate this thing called the Warsaw Pact, which was essentially their version of NATO rivaling the United States. So to go off on a bit of a tangent here, I want to talk briefly about the ideology of Marxism, but also the centralized form of government to begin with, and how that played a larger role in the experiences of individuals within the economy. So the ultimate collapse of the USSR can be predominantly blamed on their central internal focus. It really has nothing to do, other countries played a part, and I'll touch on that later, but when I say central focused, I don't mean focused solely within the USSR. I mean fully focused within the bloated Communist Party itself, the bloated nepotist economic system that they had created. People in charge had no real understanding of what it was like to be a member of a communist society, and this ties into an explanation by Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince. This is a book of political philosophy, and it explains how a new prince leader is supposed to maintain a new principality, their land. And I think it gives a really good explanation for how the USSR eventually fell. And it's this one quote, I can't remember what page number it's on, but it's this idea of, he says, for a prince to maintain a new principality, he must be on the scene, involved with the new people, catch rivalries as they come up, and squash plights before they appear. So what he's essentially saying here is that the job of a dictator or a ruler is to understand what is going on within his new principality, to be involved with the people, and to catch any any uprisings that might come up before they grow into something that can be considered a real threat. The way that he actually says it is really funny. He talks about the pancreas and it growing, and the only way to solve the pancreas is to catch it originally. And it's pretty funny. And I would highly recommend anybody who wants a better understanding of political philosophy and how to rule a country. I don't know if that's going to help you, but it is a very interesting book, and it is a very good read in my opinion. But I digress slightly. And so this system of centralized economy is kind of ruining the people's relationship with their government, and the government has no idea, because they are stuck in these old ways of Marxist theory where it's to each according to their need and from each according to their ability. But here we are, it's the USSR, and I'm in control, so I'm going to tell you what you need, and I'm going to tell you how much you have to give. So they bent Marxism, they ignored Machiavelli, and they're now creating an economic system that breaks the three fundamental rules of economics. Well, they break two out of the three and ignore the third. So the three fundamental rules are of production are land, capital, and labor. Land is kind of a misnomer. It's not really in this scenario because they are communist and they own all of the land, so that's not really something that we need to talk about, other than the fact that they have just kind of stripped it from the people and become very similar to the Tsarist Empire they once overthrew. Now, the other two, those are the interesting ones, and I'm going to start with the mismanagement of labor. And the reason that this is important is because the system of centralized economy created a systemic miasma of fear. And it's interesting because fear plays two roles within the USSR. One, it is an incredibly useful tool for manipulation. It is very easy to make people believe and do what you want when they are constantly afraid, and that is something that Stalin used perpetually throughout his reign as a way of maintaining control, is the fear of the USSR, the fear of my almighty power and the Red Army and what I will do to you if you disobey and fight me. Remember, an example of this is Hungary in 1954. Another example of this is the Great Terror in 1937. And it was this a perpetual thing within the USSR, is this miasma of fear. What this did do for the USSR in a negative connotation was completely strip creativity, experience, and the desire for individuals to want to try. Workers were afraid of managers were afraid of government, and nobody was going to ask questions about what they were doing wrong and how they were doing it wrong. To give an example of this, if I was in a factory and I didn't know how to use an angle grinder, it's a electric blade used to cut steel, rather than asking, I would just make it up. I would try, and I wouldn't ask, because if I asked, I'd be afraid that I would get the gulag and I would die. So I would lie a lot, and if I didn't know how to do it and I tried and I failed, I would lie to my manager and say, I did this much, don't worry about it. And then he would lie to his superior about the amount of production that was done, and then the owner of the factory would lie to the government, and it was just a perpetual cycle of economic statistics that were based fundamentally on lies. So that's one angle of this perpetual fear that really, really damaged the mismanagement of labor. And the other one that is kind of important is the fundamental idea of progression that was stripped from the USSR. So there's this idea in society, and some people agree with it, some people don't. And I personally think that it's incredibly true, and it's that failure is the best teacher. It's the thing that allows you to learn what you've done wrong and what you can do right, because you're not going to get things right every single time. It's not going to happen. It's the same philosophy that professors operate under when they have tenure. They're supposed to experiment and try, and they're not expected to get it right every single time, because it's completely ridiculous to assume that they're going to do that. But it is still important for us to discover new things, and to discover new things you need to mess up. Now, this whole system was completely stripped from the USSR, and it is something that on the whole greatly punished Russia's economic development. So with the CPSU operating on an ideology of giving according to need and taking according to ability, this system had a second form of fault, and that is an extreme mismanagement of resources. And the reasoning behind this is because within that system, intelligent intellectual managers who have fought through climbed through the ranks of the Communist Party and given themselves a managerial position, understand the system and frameworks that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union have laid out for them. And if they're ambitious enough, they want to take full advantage of it. And if they're ambitious enough, they're going to take full advantage of it. The way that they would do this is something called deliberate inefficiency, and this is something that's very prevalent in the non-private sectors of the economy today within Canada and the United States. But since the USSR was all non-private sectors, it was prevalent throughout all branches of the economy. And the way that this would work is that the USSR had a strange desire to focus on inefficiencies. If I was going to use the example of a potato farm, for instance, And I was told, hey, your production cost needs to be 2 million. And I'd go, okay, cool, I'll make 2 million potatoes. I'll grow 2 million pounds of potatoes. And I fail, and I make 1 million pounds of potatoes instead. The USSR would simply double the amount of resources needed for my company. They would double the allocation of workers. They would double the number of the amount of fertilizer I would get, hoping that it would double the outcome. And this system doesn't make sense economically, but what it does do is make everybody happy. And when I say that, I mean it produces big numbers, because people don't see the cost of what goes into a project, but they do see the outcome. And these big numbers were very vital to the USSR when it comes to their relationship with the United States and the experience of the feelings that individuals had operating and living within the USSR. This is something that I'll go and touch on further because it is very crucial in understanding the economic policies of the USSR and seeing a bit of method within their madness. So, this idea of deliberate inefficiency, this system has been established and people understand that this is how things work. So how are you going to take advantage of that? You don't get to make more money. It's a communist party. You have no property. There's nothing like that. Everything is quote unquote equal, although it's really, really, really not. A good way of putting it is that it's equal for some and a little bit more equal for others. So how are you going to become one of the more equal? And the best way to do that is to take advantage of the system that perpetuates inefficiency rather than productivity. If I ran my company very efficiently and I produced exactly what the centralized government asked me to do using the minimum resources they provided, then during the next quarter, when they dictate the next allocation of resources, I wouldn't get any more. They would assume, okay, well, he already did it and he reached what our requests were, so he can clearly do it again. But hey, this company over here, this potato farm, they kind of failed. Well, let's double their resources. Let's make it so that they get exactly what they need. Where are we going to get that from? Let's take it from the company that's succeeding. So their system was constantly pumping energy into inefficient industries and taking away from the efficient ones and punishing the efficient ones. So myself, as the manager who is running my company that was streamlined, am now punished for doing a good job. To take full advantage of this, what I would then do is barely toe the line. That's the best way of putting it. I would go, okay, you want me to produce 2 million pounds of potatoes? I'm going to produce 1.8 million. And I'd produce 1.8 million and I'd use all the resources and I'd go, look guys, I was so close. I did it this way. I did it this way. I did quote unquote everything in my power to make it happen. Just give me a little bit more. And so the USSR would give me a little bit more, and then I would get a little bit more every single year. And it would perpetuate a desire of deliberate inefficiency. And as long as I didn't get caught, which is the key, as long as I didn't get caught, it would keep happening over and over and over again. And this is systemic throughout the entire USSR industry. And it proves a real problem for their economic policies in the future. In the beginning, when it's post-World War II and there's a massive competition for economic projects in the space race and all these things, people aren't very focused on it. But come later into the future, it very, very becomes a detriment to the USSR because they refuse to learn from history or to change. They're very fixated on these ideas of the past, Stalinism, Leninism, Marxism, and they do not like to look forward until Gorbachev came along and it was far too late. So there is method to their madness. There is reason in their economic insanity, and it's founded within the relationship between the USSR and the United States. You see, in the post-World War II era, the threat of the fascist Nazi regime had been defeated, and this left these two polarizing ideologies, communism and capitalism, at the pinnacle of global power. Rooted in fundamental opposition, each side fought tooth and nail to demonstrate their superiority over the other, forcing every country around the world to ask the question, what was better, communism or capitalism, equality or equity, negative liberties or positive liberty? Now, because of the USSR's hyper-inefficient economic system, they were forced to play kind of a game of catch-up with the US the entire time, basically a trailing shadow or a step behind the US in every technological advancement that came forward. To give some examples of this, the US created the atomic bomb first, and the USSR did it secondary. The US created the hydrogen bomb first, and the USSR did it secondary. To give some credit to the USSR, they were the first group of individuals, the first nation to launch a satellite into space, and subsequently the first person into space in 1961. But again, this was primarily overshadowed by the US landing a man on the moon in 1969. So, why was this happening? Why was the USSR constantly behind the US in new technologies and new advancements? And an argument can be made that it was because of the US's incredibly intelligent decision to snatch up as many German scientists as they could during the fall of the Nazi regime and the end of World War II. But a large part of it can also be founded in communist ideology. We've already established that their economic system was predicated on communism and their beliefs, which on the whole greatly inhibited their ability to fight the forefront war that was the Cold War. And when I say forefront, I wanted to establish this idea that I've come to terms with, and it's that the Cold War was battled on 4 different angles. There was the angle of ideology that encompassed the philosophies of equality and equity and the subsequent quality of life that came from it. But there's also the far more tangible side of the discussion that involves economics and the 3 kind of frameworks to make an efficient economic system run. And this was the military, the capitalist market, and the consumer market. Now, because of the way that communism works, the consumer market was kind of stripped out of the equation for the USSR and their economic system. And what happens when you remove one side of a triangle is it becomes a far more weaker system. Kind of a primitive way of thinking about it, but it's really, really true. Every advancement in technology that they had wasn't filtered back into the system, and I'll get on to explaining that a little bit later, but it greatly, greatly damaged their ability to fight effectively in this 4-sided conflict, and subsequently also weakened their quality of life and the argument about why equity and communism was better than capitalism and equality. Because of the USSR's kind of forced choice to remove consumerism from the 3-sided triangle of economic production, they were forced to operate within a system where their citizens had no buying power, something that cannot be said of the US. And this created a relationship where any advancements in technology were solely focused towards one thing, maintaining the status quo of being a global superpower. Unlike the USSR, the United States, as they continued to advance their technologies, would be filtered back into the consumer markets, improving the quality of service and the quality of life that its civilians operated under. For example, if I was going to give a definition or draw you a picture or sketch out a picture, imagine military jets. Now, both sides are fighting to impose and maintain their military presence and are constantly evolving this technology. But the USSR, while constantly pumping money into it and only really maintaining a perceived image here, the US was actually benefiting from this, as any advancements in technology that they used to improve their fighter jets were also used to improve commercial airlines and their planes. Now, the reason that this benefited the US so much is because of their citizens with purchasing power and the free market that they lived in. Citizens were able to buy these planes and afford to fly around the world and pump large amounts of revenue back into the United States government, something that the Soviets were completely unable to take advantage of. Their citizens had no buying power and were completely incapable of buying planes or buying flights around the world or buying flights around the USSR even. And this was a predominant story among all forms of technology. It wasn't just in planes. It was in every advancement in technology that came out of the USSR. The citizens couldn't afford to buy it. They couldn't afford to have that be a part of their life. And this, let alone damage the economy, also, again, damaged the quality of life for those citizens. So taking a moment to step away from citizens' quality of life, I want to focus on the military aspect of the USSR and US economy. Now, the US actually had a couple huge benefits when it came to this Cold War, or this war of doctrine and ideology. And this is predominantly because of their, frankly, quite larger GDP. And what a GDP is, it's called a gross domestic product. And the reason that their gross domestic product was so much higher was, again, because of the purchasing power of its civilians and the consumer market, but also because of its semi-global trade system that it set up. Now, as a note here, the US currency post-World War II became the fundamental base currency in which every other currency on the planet was based off of. This is what they did. It was a genius move, and it isolated the USSR because although their ruble, their form of currency, was equivalently and essentially equal to the United States at this time, it wasn't accepted anywhere else outside of the USSR, making their economic system isolated solely to their Warsaw Pact and not really available, or not without them really having the ability to branch out and trade with other countries. So why is this relevant? Well, you see, in these battle of ideologies, in this war between communism and capitalism, all hands were on deck. Every country around the world was watching it happen, and this is primarily due to the military power, or to be more precise, nuclear power, these two countries had. Each had the ability to wipe the other off the face of the planet, and anybody else who was associated with them. This defined a relationship where neither side could really take action. They were both forced to threaten and call each other's bluffs, but neither side could actually launch a military campaign, because if they did so, it would result in mutual destruction. It turned out that this was incredibly beneficial for the economic system the United States had cultivated around itself. And this is because, again, back to the consumer markets, well, the two sides were constantly improving their military. Only the US was benefiting through it economically. For the Soviet Union, it was just costing them a massive black hole of resources. And the US took this and they made it, to be honest, very, very intelligently. They took full advantage of this, allocating roughly 7% of its total GDP towards its military. To give you some hard numbers, that is essentially, back then it was $715 billion, and nowadays worth about 19.8 trillion. And because of this military dynamic between the two, the USSR was forced to match it and forced to mirror it. But with their isolated and under-efficient economy, what essentially happened was they were forced to use 17% of its total GDP into matching, not even surpassing, but matching the military capabilities of the United States. As you can imagine, that is an exorbitant amount of a industry's capability. It's essentially almost 1/5 of the total amount of revenue and products the USSR created. And reminding you again, that didn't help them. That didn't grow the USSR's economy. That was only to maintain its status quo as a global superpower, which means if they're going to match and mirror this quantifiable number, they have to draw resources from somewhere else. And where else are they going to draw it from than the system they already have decided doesn't matter? Consumerism. Essentially deteriorating and focusing away from the quality of life and experiences of the individuals who live within the communist state. And it's kind of here in this continuous pushing aside and brushing away of consumerism and abandoning the quality of life aspect, where the USSR really lost the Cold War on the whole and capitalism won. And it's because if we look at a socialist country today like Norway, they care about their people. It's social. It's about people. And extensively, that's what communism was supposed to be. But instead, they continued to perpetuate this fixation on capitalist products. And when I say capitalist products, I don't mean capitalism as in the US or capitalism as in equality, but I mean capitalism as tools items that are designed to generate value for yourself, like a furnace or an angle grinder. A great example of this today is like Tesla, who they do not use any of their gross revenue to buy luxury items, but simply funnel it back into the system to perpetually advance their technology and their batteries and their cars. And this is great for a company, but it doesn't quite work for an empire that is supposed to be presenting an argument for why communism is better than capitalism. An argument can be made that in the beginning it made a lot of sense. They started off behind, they were light years behind the US and light years behind Britain. They were a third world economic failure where nobody was educated. And so it does make sense that they had this system in the beginning, but for some reason, the USSR, they never wanted to move on, they never wanted to advance, and they were fixated on this idea of equity, of creating equality outcome for all, but rather than improving the standards of living for everyone, they figured it would just be easier to make everybody else's life harder. And this is kind of the real downside of the USSR's economy, is the beyond the inefficiencies and the blindness is the reality of the situation for the people who lived within the USSR. They had it really, really hard, and until the advancements of technology came to a point where they were able to see what the rest of the world was living like, they thought that they were fine. They thought it was okay because their perceived reality was so carefully cultivated by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Citizens only compared their lives to that of their surroundings, their neighbors, other people around them, and they determined that they were equal and that life was okay because that's the perspective they had, the Platonic cave that they were embedded in. But with the advent of technology and the understanding of what the rest of the world looked like, primarily their capitalist counterparts in the West, they began to wonder what was going on. Why does it look like their economy was growing so rapidly and yet it felt stagnant and there was still poverty and there was still famine? And this fed political discontent, and this kind of was the beginning of the end for communism. It's the start of what essentially ate away at the USSR from the inside out, causing its implosion. Now, throughout my research, I came across quite a few primary sources of people discussing their experiences living in this incredibly unequal society and what it was like to be under the Communist Party dictatorship and living through Stalin. But there was one in particular that kind of spoke to me, and I'm going to tell her story now, acting as kind of a mouthpiece for her tale. And if you want to hear her story with genuine sincerity and every ounce of emotion behind it, the podcast in which she gave her story or told her story will be linked in the description below. It's called the What Then Must We Do, and it's a very excellent listen. I super recommend listening to it. Essentially a chronological explanation of the brainwashing of the Communist Party and how all-encompassing it was within her society, even from the youngest age. So the way that the system seemed to work was at the ages of 5 and 6, when you were attending your first year of school, before you even knew what ideology was or political science or philosophy, you were mandated to enter a pledge of allegiance to the Communist Party. You would show up to a kind of first year opening school party, except it was a ceremony where you'd dress up in formal wear and wear white shirts and pledge your allegiance to the Communist Party. This shows how fast and how early on the brainwashing began, because it really was all-encompassing. And I'm going to use that word quite a lot because it's the best way to describe what the relationship between the citizens and the Communist Party is they were a god. They were essentially a religion that dictated and controlled every aspect of everybody's lives from a centralized point in Moscow. Now, this Hungarian girl, she did pledge her allegiance and got the blue scarf and wore the uniform and proceeded through the next couple of years of school, despite the fact that her family was Christian and relatively opposed to the communist ideology on the whole. Now, where the story gets a little dark and you start to really see the implications behind it is coming into the 6th year or graduating year of middle school into what their form of high school was. And that is when they have to make a second allegiance, a second pledge that would be marked with, where individuals would be marked with a red scarf to show their new found loyalty to the Communist Party. And the reason it's so appalling and so terrifying is because if you didn't make this pledge of allegiance to the Communist Party, you would be disavowed. You would be sent out as an outcast and made a pariah. And when I say that, I don't necessarily just mean a social pariah, but I also mean a economic pariah, a member of community that is an outcast. Your proposition and possibility for advancement would be completely stripped of you. There was no opportunity for secondary education if you did not pledge yourself wholly to the Communist Party. And thus, any aspects of possible dreaming of job or career path or lifestyle you might want to embark on was impossible because you could not get a secondary education or any higher form of education past middle school without pledging your allegiance to this communist ideology. So for the story of Edith, she pledged her allegiance in the beginning, and she really didn't want to pledge her allegiance for the second time, but due to the insistence of her teacher, who appeared to see some thread of potential in her, convinced her and her parents at the last minute to do so, and she did, and she got her red scarf and she proceeded to secondary education. And here in her first day of school is where the first real aspects of this brainwashing seem to come into play, because the teacher sits down and asks everybody, raise your hand if you'd like to join the Communist Youth Party. And the entire class raised their hand, except for Edith. And then the teacher says, raise your hand if you don't want to be a part of the Communist Youth Party. And she was the only one who raised her hand. And from that moment on, she was a complete pariah. And in her own words, she says, nobody wanted to be my friend. Nobody wanted to associate with me. I felt as though I was completely alone and a complete outcast in isolation. And in that moment, I was more depressed than I've ever been in my entire life. I thought that I was the worst child in the world and that nobody would ever love me. Coming from her, when she says it, the words, even now, about 40 years later, are so filled with sadness and a deep pain that you can hear as her voice cracks as she recounts this story. And to me, what this really does was show how succinctly and all-encompassing this brainwashing was, because even her, as somebody who did not believe in the communist vision in their message, felt as though by saying no and saying I don't want to do it, she was a failure. And a second form of the brainwashing that is shown is that all of her peers sent her into outcast because she didn't want to be communist, because she didn't want to follow an ideology she did not believe in. The part that makes this the most scary is because there was no escape. There was no choice. She did not choose to go to a school that practiced communism. She did not, like someone might go to a religious school today. It was forced upon her. It was in her, and it was the entire society she was in, and she was not able to escape. If she did, she tells later in the podcast, she tells stories of friends and family she knew who were mowed down in Hungary as they tried to run across the border. It was mandatory, and it was the reality that she lived in until 1989 or 1991, when the Berlin Wall fell and communism ended in the Soviet Union. A couple people might say, well, you don't need higher education. You can always just work and make some money and try. But the thing is that the Communist Party, they didn't let that happen either. There was no businesses. There was no private sector. You had no opportunity to be a philanthropist and try things on your own. It was this system, this way, follow it, starve, or die. And that was it. What this story and experience of a girl named Edith and my own personal exploration through the antithesis of our economic system really solidifies and cements in me is a question about And it's a question about education on the whole, which it seems like a weird conclusion to draw, but I'm really curious about why there are so many people nowadays who are interested in perpetuating this socialist system and this communist system, and why so many people are scared of a free market society. I understand that at the end of the day, communism is a far left ideology, and the left is a lot more social, it's a lot more friendly appearing than the right wing politics of the past. But there's also a lot of harshities, especially when you move to a far end of any political spectrum. And what this has shown me is that communism as an ideology is a great theory, but it really doesn't work with fundamental human nature. Because for any industry to be free, to be in a state where everybody is equal and everybody ends up being the same, somebody has to dictate that and somebody has to be on top. And what ends up happening is far closer to the Tsarist empires of Russia that were once sought to be overthrown than the Garden of Eden and paradise that Marx wanted to create. For me personally, at the end of this course and the end of my research, I think that I can conclusively say that I am not pro-communist. I do not like the ideologies that are brought. I do not like the way that it becomes played out when interacted with the complicated thing that is humanism. I feel as though it incentivizes individuals to be lazy, and it punishes success. It punishes people who are trying to work hard, which kind of diminishes everything that many of my peers around me are trying to do in taking this leap and this gamble of secondary education and a lot of other things. It is apparent to me that equity versus equality will continue to be a conversation as individuals are set out to explore the world around them and discover the systems that they are involved in. Personally, until a society comes up that demonstrates a system for controlled equity where there is no dictator at the top, there is no 1%, I am not interested in a world where we all end up in quote unquote the same place, a manufactured same place of poverty. I understand that capitalism does not perpetuate a proper form of equality. It is a goal of it, but there is still massive inequality between men and women, disabled and not disabled, privileged and not privileged. This is something that will continue throughout society no matter what, as natural inequality is a huge part of humanism. But for now, I stay on the side of equality. I hope one day that equity may have a resurgence and play out in a way different from the USSR. They did not completely fail the United Soviet Socialist Union. There was several things that they did that are to be praised, but ironically enough, none of them really followed the true path of communism. None of them really followed the true path of socialism. And by breaking down their economic system, I hope I was able to demonstrate to you some of the ways that they failed and the correct path they could have taken in order to facilitate a much more equal, aquatic society. I would like to take a moment to say thank you to Professor Cheek and Calvin, who gave me the opportunity of presenting my final project for History 104 in such an unorthodox way. I think it speaks volumes to the progressive nature of many of the teachers at UBC and the direction in which education is moving on a whole. Due to the style of presentation that I embarked on, where it was a memorized sheet of research and information that I had cultivated over the last couple of weeks, I would like to offer a link in the description below towards many of the facts and research tools that I used. Inevitably, some of the information I said may be false, and there is all of the true hands-on data and statistics down there in the description if you're interested in fact-checking me. Additionally, there will be a bibliography of all of the sources, about 15 to 16 I believe, that I used to find this data, and that will also be linked in the description below. I hope you found this podcast educational and insightful, and I'm excited to try and do further episodes like this in the future as projects unfold in front of me throughout my UBC career.